Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev. And in this video, what I want to do is basically show like a custom implementation of RPC. So I'm not using gRPC, I'm not using tRPC, these frameworks for creating RPC APIs. I'm going to create it from scratch just to kind of like demonstrate in principle what an RPC framework does. You can kind of really see under the hood in a very simple implementation what an RPC API really is. Okay, because oftentimes it's like any framework. The framework kind of abstracts what's really going on. You can use it. I can use gRPC and tRPC, and they are great for building the API. But sometimes you're just like, wow, that's magic. So this will help you kind of understand sort of like at a higher level what's going on. So first, let's just talk about what RPC means. So generally, there's like three main ways to architect an API when we think about your traditional sort of like server-side APIs. So there's your traditional REST API, still probably the most dominant way of doing it. And the idea here is that you would just create your server and different URLs would do different things. And basically your applications would just make the right requests to the right URLs. And there is nothing wrong with that. That works perfectly fine. But on the client side, when you're writing sort of your client-side code, you're constantly having to manually write these HTTP requests, and because every endpoint may work different, every API may work different. There's not really like a standard playbook. I mean, there's like the RESTful convention and RESTful routes, but even that there can be a lot of deviation from API to API. So you're manually writing a lot of these HTTP requests, whether you're using like things like fetch, Axios, when we're talking about JavaScript, which is fine. Like if you're comfortable with that, I'm totally comfortable with that. But sometimes you want something a little different. Now, then there's GraphQL. Okay, the way the GraphQL works is that there's just generally one endpoint, and it's just one endpoint that receives a string. Okay, so generally what you're doing is you're making a post request to this endpoint with a string, and the string is basically written in the GraphQL, the graph query language. And basically the GraphQL API uses the GraphQL libraries to parse that string, and it's going to call one of many functions you have queued up. So it's going to be very much like what we're doing with RPC, except that basically you're doing it through a query language. You're expressing a language, and the nice things about the GraphQL query language is it gives you much more room to express things other than just what you want to do, but also what you want to get back, which is pretty cool. Okay, I definitely enjoy a GraphQL API. Then there's RPC, which has been around, but I think like it's gotten a lot more attention the last couple of years because of the frameworks that have been built for building RPC API. So RPC is the architectural pattern. gRPC, tRPC are frameworks for doing that. Okay, so RPC, remote procedural call, the idea is that you want to make accessing the things your server can do feel more like you're just running functions in your client. Okay, so basically when I'm running my front end code, I want to be able to just say, hey, I want my server to do this in the same way that I can write any function in my front end. So essentially this takes two pieces. You make a API, you implement your server, but you're going to implement it in a way where you come, and then again, how you do this, there's infinite ways you can do this, but at the end of the day, like the end result is that you're going to have a client on the front end that should be able to call any of the procedures for your server in a more imperative function-like way. Okay, and that's essentially what it is. It's just trying to make API calls feel more like functions. We do this all the time with like REST and GraphQL APIs. I know every time I'm working in an application with a REST or a GraphQL API, you oftentimes will make functions for the different calls you're going to make. But you have to do it one by one. So every time you want to make a new call, you make a new function that just makes that call more imperative. Or declarative, depending on the style of how you wrote the function. In RPC, the idea is you're creating a framework where you can continuously add more actions without necessarily having to continuously develop all these additional functions. You just have sort of this one interface to interface with all the possible actions of your server. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Express to build out such a framework, and just so here we go. So I'm just going to show sort of one way where you can kind of get that end result, that sort of RPC style API. So what we're going to do is I'm going to just start out by building out a normal Express API. So I'm going to just touch my server.js. I am going to what else am I going to want? I'm just going to make dir all the other folders I would usually need, which I probably won't need them all, but just out of habit. Models, views, controllers, public. Okay, make all that. I'm going to create my package.json, npm init-y. Then I am going to install Express, npm install Express. Am I going to want anything else other than Express? Thinking about that. I think for today's purposes, I think I'll be fine with just Express. I'll install Morgan just so we can have those Morgan logs. Okay. So let's just kind of sketch out a basic Express server. Okay. Now let's see here. Const express equals require express. Okay, then we're going to create the express object, the app object, app equals express. Again, this is not an express lesson, so if you're not familiar with express, you can watch my introduction to express videos, but I think you should, if you're familiar with JavaScript, you should be able to capture, or even just programming in general, you should be able to capture the main thrust of what I'm trying to illustrate here. App express, so that's just creating our server. I'm just going to create a basic practice route, or main route. The request response object. And we're going to want to res.send. It works. And actually, while I'm at that, I'm going to want some middleware to parse JSON bodies because we're going to rely on JSON. So express.json. Okay, so that's going to be for, and then of course I mentioned that we brought in Morgan, so we should probably bring that in. Const Morgan equals require Morgan. Got it. And then we're going to want to register that as middleware. App.use Morgan, and we'll use the dev preset. Okay, so just to kind of put some comments, so when you look at my repo, so again, always in the video description is a repo with like folders for many of the videos that I've made. Again, we import deps, create our app object, register middleware, okay, and then register routes, and then last we're going to want to start the server. App.listen. Okay, and we'll just make that on port 444. Listening on port 4444. Okay, cool. So basically we sketched out our basic server. So let me just try that out real quick. So nodamon server.js. Okay, so far looking good. Now let's go to localhost 44444. Cool. Okay, wonderful. So here's what I'm going to do. I am going to have one route that's going to handle all my RPC calls. Okay, so we're going to call this my RPC Endpoint. So we'll make this app.post. We're just going to always post to it, and it's going to be /RPC. Okay. And basic, what it's going to do, it's going to receive the request and response object. And what's going to happen is we're going to have several functions being passed. Okay. And so what's going to happen, we don't have that function yet. So right now we're just going to res.send, hello. That's fine for now. Okay, so what I want to do is architect sort of like my function calls. Because the idea behind RPC is that you can have a lot of different possible functions that you can call from one or many endpoints. The actual endpoint structure is not so much as important as the client structure, but I do have a certain end result in my mind. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another file, and we'll just call this actions.js. So this is going to be where I put all my actions. Okay, and we're going to define an array in here. So we're going to call this like sample data. We'll just call it to-dos, which is going to equal an array, and then we're going to have one to-do. Each to-do will be an object with a key of message. That this one's going to say breakfast. This is what I usually do. Okay, this is going to be the data we work with for the purposes of our API. Some sample data. Now, what we're going to do is create const actions, which is going to be an object with a bunch of different functions in it, and each function will have a name. Because the reason is that instead of like an array, I'm going to use an object because I'm going to be able to call the unique functions dynamically via the key. And you'll see kind of like how I plan on doing that. Okay, and I'm going to expect that each function should be able to get a sort of argument object. Like, so it'll be like, I'm going to kind of copy the Redux style on the client side, where basically if you ever use Redux and you do like or Redux or on React, or use like the use reducer hook, what you would do is you use like this dispatch function, and then you'd pass like the dispatch function, this object that has like an action and a payload. The action would be a string. That's going to be how we identify which function we're calling, and then the payload would be like the arguments you're passing in. That's kind of, I'm going to follow that exact style in this sort of RPC API. So it's going to kind of have a Redux feel of RPC. So we're going to create two functions: get to-dos, which will be a function that receives the payload. Okay, not that we're going to use it, and just is just going to return the to-dos. That's going to be pretty straightforward. Okay, and then we're going to have create to-do that is going to receive the payload. Okay, and it is going to take the payload dot message. So we're going to expect there's going to be a property in there. Actually, we're going to const new to do equals an object which have a property called message, which is going to take the message property from the payload. Then we're going to push the new to do. So to-dos dot push. And we're going to push the new to do in there. And then after we are done doing that, we'll return a message of success. Okay. And that's essentially how this is going to work. Okay. So then I'm going to want to export this object, module.export equals actions. Okay, cool. And again, the idea is that any other functions, any other actions I would want my API to do, I'm just going to add them to this object. So I can just put all the possible functions in there. Now in my server.js, what's going to happen is that I'm going to expect that the request body is going to be in that sort of dispatch function style, where it's going to have, like, again, the action property and the payload property. So what's going to happen is that I'm going to import actions. So I'm going to const actions equals require. Okay, const require /actions. Okay, so then what's going to happen is that we're going to take the result of this call. It's going to be the result of we take actions, which is again an object. We're going to call the particular key based on the rec.body.action, because I'm going to expect that's the contract that they have to pass that action on the other side. Okay, and it's going to be a function we're going to invoke, but that function is going to receive the rec.body.payload. Okay, and then that'll be the argument to that function, and then the result of that function is the result, which then gets sent back as the API result. Okay, so technically I've done, that's the API. Okay, I can now test this out in, like, at least a server side. Okay, again, the real important part of RPC is the client side. Okay, but now let's try this out. So if I go to localhost 4000, actually it's like 444, I think. Is that right? Yep, 4444. So I'm using Insomnia instead of Postman. /RPC. What I'm going to do is make a post request, and then we're going to submit an object. And the action that I want is going to be get to-dos, and the payload will just be an empty object. Okay, and again, this is JSON, so these keys should have quotation marks. So theoretically, this should get me the array with breakfast. And that's exactly what it does. And then if I want to do create to-dos, and then I just pass the payload with a message property, message lunch. Okay, and again, that's got to have a key in it too. I mean, quotations are on that key. Now if I send this, Adi is not a function. Okay, so there, that key, oh, did I spell create to do? Oh, it's create to do, that's why. Okay, send. Success. Okay, so that time I did it. Now if I do get to do's again, I should see that updated list. Ta-da! Okay, so basically there I am now able to kind of interact with my entire API from one endpoint using this sort of like Redux style request body. Okay, so that's pretty easy. So the idea is that there's this sort of like, and that's always important with like an RPC call. There has to be sort of a standard way you're doing the thing because it's going to have to be mirrored on the client when you build the client. Okay, so now that we have that and we established that that works, the server is working now for me to build the client side. Okay, so what I'm going to do is that's going to happen in my public folder because we're going to create the index.html in there. But first I'm going to create we're going to call this the client.js. And essentially what the client is, so we're going to create a function, an async function called RPC client. And with the RPC client, it's going to receive the details, we'll call it. So, and that'll be just an object with action and payload, which now that I'm thinking about it, the way Redux does it is the whole object is action, and technically it's supposed to be type and payload. Oh well, I always make that mistake. It's fine. We're this deep. Should I go change it? I should probably just change it. Because all I would do is just change it right here. And then after that, we just type. Okay. Cool. Now it'll be more like following the more Redux style, for those who are familiar with like Redux conventions. Okay, so the client. So it's going to be a function. And basically what the function is going to do is that it's just going to make an API call. Const fetch. It's going to be to HTTP localhost 4444/RPC. And basically it's always going to be making a method put request, or post request. And what does it not like? Fetch. Doesn't like something. I made a mistake somewhere. Oh, I wrote const fetch. Const response equals await fetch. There we go. Method post body. So this would be like JSON dot stringify if I can spell correctly today. JSON.stringify, and then we pass in the details object, because the details object is really what the API call needs. Okay. Then const the result equals await response.json. Okay, and then we'll return the result. Okay. Cool. Now that function will be defined, and that function will be able to make those calls for us. Okay. So now I can create like an index.html. So let's say here, new file, index.html. Actually, we'll just call this main.html. But now in order to actually access that page, I need to add a static server to the middleware. So app.use express.static public. Okay. So I'm going to write up my HTML file. I'm going to attach that JavaScript. So script source, and that's going to be /client.js. Good. And I'm going to just have an h1 over here. To-dos. We're going to have a UL here where we're going to render those to-dos. And then we're going to write our JavaScript right over here. Okay, and then I should have access to that client because I've imported the client here. So I have access to that, and which again, the name of that function is RPC client. Okay, so what I can do is I can just say, if I want to go like initially populate this stuff with like the to-dos, we can do something like this. RPC client, then we pass in the type, which is going to be get to-dos, and then the payload, which is just being at the object because we're not doing anything with it for that particular action. And that's going to return a promise. Okay. So then I can just do like my.then. Okay. .then. Actually, I should probably package this as a function so that way I can do this multiple times. So let's do function. Make this an async function. Async function render to-dos. Okay. And that way we can be like const to-dos equals await RPC client. And let me just make sure I spelled that right. RPC client. And again, that should be available because we're importing it there. So RPC client. And then we pass in the type of get to-dos and the payload. Get an empty object. And that should give me the to-dos. And you see, like, the benefit here is, like, see, like, that's a lot simpler than having to think about, like, what's the endpoint for each one. As opposed to getter, you know, I just say, okay, hey, this is the thing I'm trying to do, the function I'm trying to call on my server, and then, you know, pass any arguments. So every RPC framework is going to have some sort of variation on this, where you basically, you're just doing function calls, okay, and it's going to get you to do the thing that you want it to do, okay. You know, gRPC does it where you define a protofile, and that protofile acts as like the contract defining what the client, you know, what that standard is. So your standard can vary, but as long as the protofile defines it. In tRPC, it's done through a typing. Here, I'm just kind of following sort of like the Redux API a little bit and modeling it off that. But you guys get the idea. The idea is that on the client side, I'm doing function calls. I'm not having to worry about like doing all these fetch calls and response.jsons and all that stuff, because technically the client is doing that for me. And again, when you're using gRPC and tRPC, that step of me creating the client, that's already abstracted away from you. Like that's the part you don't see, that function that you're calling is doing something like this. Okay, but you just get to call a function like this, and it's just going to interact with your server. So you're writing client-side code that's actually triggering server-side actions without you having to really think about that communication with the server, and that's the benefit of RPC. of that type of architecture, that type of thinking. But okay, so that should get the to-dos, and we'll test if it's all working in a second. And then I can go then render those to-dos. Okay, so then I can just be like const ul equals document dot query selector ul, and then we'll say for let to do of to-dos. Okay, and basically what we're going to do is just create an li. So const li equals document dot create element, and we're going to create an li. Then we're going to change the li's inner text and change that to match the to-dos message. So to-do.message. And you know what? I'm going to want to clear out that UL while I'm at it. So I'm going to say UL dot inner HTML equals nothing. So that's going to empty out the UL each time we render it. Okay, li, and then we just need to append it. So ul dot append li. There we go. Okay. So now I should be able to initially call this function render to dos, and that should populate the page. So if I go to localhost 4444/main .html, I don't see the to do. So let's see here. Require is not defined. Get to dos is not defined. So that's happening at render to dos. So where is it saying get to dos is not defined? Oh, because I wrote it as a variable, not a string. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, post localhost 444 500 not valid JSON. Okay, oh, then I put require here. So did I write require in here? Oh, because it did it on its own. Okay, let me think here. Localhost 4000. Just in case, I will uppercase this. Post, let me just see what the error we got down here was. Rec.body type. Wait, did I make the same mistake and write like get to dos? Yes, I did. Get to do. Oh no, it should be get to dos. Okay. So let's try that again. Okay, we're probably still getting that same error, right? Body.type. I did pass it as the type, so let's see what if the rec.body looks the way I expected. Okay, so let's see here. Let's console.log rec.body. Okay, let's go see that log. Post. And the body is empty. Okay, so that means there's something wrong in my client. There is the body, JSON.stringify details. Okay, that's all fine and good. Did I not do the express.json right? Express.json, that's there. That should be parsing the JSON body. So then my next question is going to be, if I go to network, let's see that call in action. So there's the call. Let me take a look at the headers, what was sent over. Request headers, content type. Oh, the headers. That's what I'm forgetting. Oh, I am out of practice. Okay, yes. I forgot that we need to include the JSON headers. So headers. Content type, because how is the server supposed to know that it's JSON data? Application slash JSON. That's how it knows. Let's try that again. Okay, so that time it was successful. So that time it worked. So we did get the array, but we still didn't get a render. So Let's take a look at the code on my main.html. And let's put a console.log to-dos here and see why that's not doing what I think it's doing. Nope. This froze. Okay, so let's try that again. Localhost 4444/main.html. Let's take a look at the console log. So we are receiving an array of 1. So that all looks good. Okay, and then let me actually just take a look at that array real quick. It's an array with an object with a property of message. So that's exactly what we expected. So, let's try this. Let me add an await here in case maybe that's what's happening. And although it shouldn't, it should be pausing the function right there. But just in case, await to do's. If I refresh. Yeah, I mean, that's the right object. To do's is the right thing. And then we're saying let to do of to do's. So let's see here, console.log to do. And that is correct. That is the object with the message of breakfast. But the error I'm getting, oh, I did it as a function. Oh. That's what happened. You should read the errors, Alex. Okay. Header text equals to do.message. Okay. So there we go. So let's refresh. And see, there we go. Okay, so now we can see that I can use that function. Again, these are the kind of implementation details that things like tRPC and gRPC make it where you don't have to worry about that. Because a lot of these, like, and that right now that has nothing to do with the RPC. It has just everything to do with just like my front end code. Okay, but let's just do one more piece to kind of illustrate this even further. Let's make a form. Okay, a form with an input with of type text, name equals message, and then we make a submit button. Input type equals submit. And that's it there. Okay, and then we're going to create a function. So I'm going to say document.querySelector. Then we're going to grab the form. And then we're going to say, hey, when there's an event on that form, so when that form is submitted, on submit, I want to run the following function. Event. Okay, event. And then we're going to want to event.prevent default so it doesn't refresh. And then we are going to want to basically make the function call. Okay, so actually I do want to make this kind of an async function so that we can use await. Okay, and then I can just be like await RPC client, and then pass it the type of create to do, and then the payload, okay, being an object with a message property, but we have to get that message property, so I need to go grab that form element. So const input equals document.querySelector, and then we're going to do it based on the attribute. So we'll just say based on name equals message. That should grab that input. And then we'll say const message equals input.value. So that way when we create the payload, it's just a object with the property message that's based off that variable using function shorthand. And then once it's done creating the to-do, we should just use render to-dos again. That should update the list. And yeah, that should work. Okay, so let's see here. Let's refresh the page. And let's try this out. If I do lunch. Okay. That still look like it refreshed the page. Lunch. So that's telling you I probably spelled prevent default wrong. Or I didn't attach the submit event appropriately. So let me think about that. We have a form element. I am targeting the form and I'm saying when we submit it, prevent default. That all looks good. So this might be the problem here. So it's saying message main.html message equals lunch line 40. So what's on line 40? Document.query selector. Somewhere I made a mistake here because it's saying query selector dot on is not a function. Oh, jQuery habits. Add event listener. There we go. Refresh. Okay, let's try this again. Lunch. Okay. Yes, and success is not valid JSON. Okay, so that's more on me having to fix to keep it simple. I am going to do this. Basically, all my actions should always return an object. So I will just say result equals success. There we go. That'll fix that. Okay, because basically what happened is it was trying to take that string and convert it into a JSON object, but that string wasn't the JSON object, so that was the issue. Okay, there we go, and it works. Lunch, dinner. Okay, and see, I'm doing that sort of with an RPC API. I only have one endpoint, but I'm able to call whatever function I want from it, and I'm able to use just, again, going forward, all I have to do is just anytime I want to add an additional thing that my API can do, I just add it to this object. Okay, so I just add a function. I don't have to think about like get or post or what the endpoint URL is. I just create a function that does the thing I want it to do. And then on the client, it should automatically just work because the client's already implemented. All I have to do is just pass in the proper type name. And that's sort of like the goal of RPC. The idea is that like it basically once it's all set up, extending it. And this is kind of similar with GraphQL. Like anytime you want to add a result, you just add a resolver. But in here, like again, you're not even having to think about like GraphQL queries or anything like that. It's just that's the function I want to call. Here's the argument to that function, and yeah, give me back my stuff. Okay, so you see, like I can just keep calling using my client to keep calling all the functions that I want. Okay, so that's essentially what you do. Usually, you'll see when you see like tRPC and gRPC, each function, because it'll actually automatically generate the client based on the contract. So in gRPC, it generates it based on the proto file. On tRPC, it generates it based on a type. But it'll actually generate a method for each of those functions. So in here, I just created one universal function that should work for every action. But you'll see in other frameworks, you'll have an object that's your client, and it'll have a function built into it for each action. And again, anytime you add an action on the server, that client will just automatically have it. So that's the cool thing about it. It's just like you can interact with your server in the same way you interact with any other code in your front end, which is nice. So hopefully this helps you understand sort of like the paradigm of RPC more. This was fun. This was a fun experiment for myself. My name is Alex Merced. Have a great day and enjoy.